Hi everyone. Thanks for coming on to my my channel and watching my message for today. And for those of you that have been watching them, this one's going to be shorter than the normal ones, and that was for a reason. It wasn't just because I couldn't think of any creative way to talk about Pentecost, which is what this message is, the day this message was preached. But the reason why it's a little shorter is because for the past few weeks, I've been asking people in my church to go through this process of trying to discern if God is calling them to a particular kind of ministry. And we took some time this past Sunday to invite those who had sensed a call to a particular kind of ministry to come forward for a time of prayer and consecration. And we had 7 people come forward, which was wonderful. And I'm very excited and anticipating some great stories to come in the months ahead as they share the results of what God does through them. So in order to be sensitive to people's customary length of time in worship, I shortened my sermon a tad. So that's why this one's a little bit shorter than normal. But hopefully you'll get something out of it anyway. And so this message is based on Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 21, which is, of course, the story of the first Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came down upon the disciples all gathered in the house. And so I'm going to read that passage and then share the message that I base this on. And I entitled this message, "The Holy Spirit removes barriers." That's what I call it. The Holy Spirit removes barriers. So let me first read that passage for you. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They have had too much wine." Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is the day of Pentecost. It's a day when we remember when the Spirit was poured out on the disciples of Jesus and the witness of the church began. Many consider Pentecost to mark the birth of the church. I have even heard some churches who throw a birthday party for the church, complete with birthday cake. But Pentecost is not just a Christian holiday that marks the official end of the Easter season. This is also a festival kept by those who practice the Jewish faith, marking 50 days after the feast of Passover. It is called Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. In the days of Jesus, this feast was a celebration of the first harvest of grain, which would be the wheat harvest. So this was a day to give thanks to God, but also a reason to party. This day was also a remembrance of when Moses received the 10 Commandments, which took place 50 days after the Israelites fled from Egypt. Let's take a minute and revisit how the giving of the 10 Commandments took place. The people had journeyed through the wilderness, making their way to the holy mountain, Mount Sinai. As they approached, on the top of the mountain there was fire and smoke, lightning, the earth was shaking. It was as if Mount Sinai was an active volcano, like we have been watching in Hawaii the past few weeks. As you might imagine, nobody wanted to go up the mountain to meet with God. It was frightening. So Moses went up the mountain by himself. All that fire and smoke that signaled the presence of God was yet another of the many demonstrations of God's deeds of power. We remember all the ways God demonstrated power through the process of getting Israel out of Egypt, which the sending of the various plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. God's presence at the summit of Mount Sinai with the fire and smoke was yet one more example. And as Moses was with God on the top of the mountain, God gave Moses the 2 tablets upon which was etched the 10 Commandments. The gift of these commandments helped to firm up a covenant between God and the children of Abraham. God had chosen them to be God's people and had delivered them from slavery. How might they give their devotion and service to the God who had claimed them and saved them? The commandments were given so the people would know what their God expects of them. The covenantal relationship between God and Israel was forged. Now we skip ahead a few thousand years. On the day of Pentecost, the first religious festival after the death of Jesus, although there were rumors that Jesus had come back to life. Jews from all across the world were in Jerusalem to celebrate Shavuot. And then, all of a sudden, God showed up in a powerful way. It wasn't quite like a volcano eruption, but it was noisy. There was a mighty wind, and there were flames of fire. Before, God's presence was way up on the top of the mountain, and Moses alone had to hike up to the top. But this time, the presence of God came down, right into the midst of the apostles and all who were gathered with them in that house. The Spirit didn't come down on one person, say Peter. No, the Spirit descended upon all who were gathered inside. The noise, the wind, the fire, all of this must have gotten the attention of all those people in the area. They must have been perplexed about what was happening at that house where there was wind and flame, but the house wasn't burning down. What is going on over there? And as people drew near, all those inside the house came bursting outside, speaking of the mighty deeds of God in the native languages of all those Jews gathered around them. 120 people streaming out into the streets, declaring with boldness the mighty deeds of God. It was noisy. The streets of Jerusalem were already filled with noise and commotion with all those people from out of town, all those people gathered for the religious ceremony and for the parties. It took a big splash to get the attention of the city. And so God acted in a way that captured the attention of everyone and filled the people with amazement and wonder as they saw Galileans speaking perfect Latin, Greek, Arabic, Farsi, or whatever native language was yours. Absolutely bewildering. Peter then quiets the crowd gathered around them, and while still filled with the Spirit, Peter proclaims his first sermon. Using as his text the prophet Joel, Peter proclaims that the Spirit of God is descending on all people, men and women, boys and girls, from all walks and stations in life. All people means all, not some, not many, all. And Peter goes on to say that all who call on the name of the Lord, not some, not many, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And on that day, we are told that 3,000 were baptized and added to the number of believers. What an awesome act of power God displayed on that day of Pentecost in Jerusalem a few thousand years ago. It was an act of power that drove the disciples out of that building and onto the streets. It was a force that could not be contained within four walls. They had to go out as they spoke of the mighty deeds of God. They went to where the people were. But they didn't speak in Hebrew or even in Aramaic unless that was your native language. No, they spoke in whatever language was needed so that the person they spoke to understood what they were saying. No translating was required. Any communication barrier was broken down by an act of God. In fact, everything that happened on that Pentecost day was the breaking down of barriers. The barrier of where God would be present, not on a faraway mountaintop, but right in the middle of the room where all the disciples were gathered. The barrier of walls and doors were broken down as the disciples rushed out into the streets. The barrier of not knowing the language of others was removed so that people could understand each other. The proclamation was made that the Spirit comes down not on one or two or some or even many, but upon everyone. The proclamation was made that all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved, Jew and Gentile. Yes, what happened at Pentecost in the city of Jerusalem was God's action of removing all barriers so that all can experience the power of God with joy and wonder. The outpouring of the Spirit continues to this day. Have you felt it? Have you ever sensed the presence of God in your midst? Sure, we don't experience the presence of God in a mighty wind and flames of fire. It's really that dramatic. But we experience that lump in the throat, a racing heart, the tightness of the stomach, the goosebumps, the catching of the breath, the shedding of a tear. When we find ourselves in the presence of holiness, of purity, of beauty, of love, that is the Spirit of God manifesting herself to us. And sometimes that same Spirit fills us up, lifts us up, and gives us the power and courage to act in ways that manifest love in the world. Sometimes the Spirit prompts us to speak to others with the language that everyone understands, and that is the language of love. Sometimes the Spirit prompts us to tell our God story, how we have experienced God in our lives, to give a witness. And sometimes the Spirit of God prompts us to do a particular kind of ministry, a specific way to express God's love in the world. Now, at this point in the message that I gave, I invited those who felt a call to do a particular kind of ministry to come forward. And so I set up that introduction. So no need for me to do that. But at any rate, that's the message that I gave this past Pentecost Sunday. I hope that it was meaningful for you and got you to thinking and were inspired and encouraged by how God is always at work breaking down barriers. I've talked about this for the past few weeks. We have a tendency to build up barriers, to set barriers between one another. But God is always in the business of bringing down barriers. God is a God of unity. God is a God of reconciliation. God is a God of peace and of love. So wherever barriers are being crossed and broken down, you can expect God to be around. Sometimes people don't like that. Sometimes people want barriers for particular political or theological reasons. God likes to break down barriers, and we see many examples of that. Perhaps if you've been listening to my sermons the past few weeks, I've been able to communicate that to you. So, thank you. thank you for listening to this video, taking the time to hear this message. And if you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to click on the subscribe button. And then if you click on that bell next to it, it'll send you you'll get a notification whenever I upload a new video. So again, thank you, and until next time, be well.